Patrice Bergeron may go down as the best two-way forward of the post-lockout era. Over 19 years, all with the Boston Bruins, he scored 427 goals and 613 assists to land third on the Bruins' all-time points list. He also won the Selke Trophy for the league's best defensive forward 6 times and 5 other times was a finalist. Bergie came up clutch time and time again, from his iconic overtime winner in Game 7 against the Maple Leafs in 2013 to what stood as the cup-clinching goal for Boston in the 2011 final versus the Canucks. The 3-year captain was also a beast in the faceoff circle, winning an astounding 58% of his draws. Patrice Bergeron stands above Tuukka Rask, David Pastrnak, Dick Clapper, and others as the best Boston Bruin who never played for another team. And that's the topic of today's video, as we'll be exploring every NHL team's greatest player who never played elsewhere. I loved covering this topic because when you think about it, many of the greatest players ended up on another team. Gretzky, Howe, Orr, Hasek, Patrick Waugh, even Boston's Eddie Shore played 10 games in a different sweater. Now before we dive in, 2 things. First, I want to thank everyone who's been supportive of my dog Cortana's recovery from knee surgery. She's back to walking around and is steadily ramping up to agility and inclines and declines. We raised over $6,000, which was absolutely huge in what has been a tough time for me. So thank you so much. And lastly, we have an awesome sponsor for this video, and that is the mobile game Pocket Hockey. I'll share some of my captured gameplay after I get through the rest of the teams in the Atlantic Division right now. Alright, let's pick things up with the Florida Panthers. I've got Alexander Barkov, the 2nd overall pick in 2013, and somebody who has been the catalyst for this franchise's turnaround. For the longest time there, they were in the doldrums of the NHL. They went, 25 years without winning a playoff series. But in this decade, Florida has been among the best of the teams out there, and they won the Stanley Cup last year, and Barkov was a huge piece of that. He had 8 goals and 14 assists in those 24 games. Actually, 4 of those goals were game winners, including Game 3 of the final versus the Oilers. He's also won the Selke Trophy as the best defensive forward in the NHL 2 times. I don't think he's necessarily done there either. At the time of me recording this, in 785 games, he has 280 goals, 483 assists for 763 points, and I think he's a future Hall of Famer. We move on to the Buffalo Sabres, and I've got Gilbert Perreault, the anchor of the French Connection line, the face of the Sabres franchise right from the get-go. 1st overall pick in the 1970 draft. He won the Calder. He led his team to the 1975 Cup final with 6 goals and 9 assists in 17 games. They did lose to the Broad Street Bullies, but the Sabres were mostly competitive. In his time there, he scored at least 30 goals 10 times, and he was actually named to the NHL's 100th anniversary team. He's in the Hockey Hall of Fame, and in almost 1,200 games, he scored over 1,300 points. The Ottawa Senators are kind of a tough team to decide here because Daniel Alfredsson's last season was with the Red Wings, and some other star players out there, Hossa, Heatley, they would move on to other teams. And I thought maybe Brady Tkachuk or Tim Stützle, but they are pretty green in their NHL careers. They haven't even made the playoffs just yet. So I've selected defenseman Chris Phillips. He played in almost 1,200 games, and yeah, I know he only put up 288 points, but he was known as a reliable shutdown defenseman. He didn't have too many highlight reel plays offensively, but he did score the overtime winner in Game 6 of the 0-3 conference final against the Devils to push it to 7. It was a very close series, and the Devils eventually won the Stanley Cup in 7. For the Toronto Maple Leafs, kind of tough to decide here. Austin Matthews could be that guy. I mean, he might become the NHL's all-time leading goal scorer at some point. He has almost 400 goals as just a 27-year-old. But I've chosen goaltender Turk Broda, not Johnny Bower, who actually started his career with the Rangers, and Dave Keon finished his career with Hartford. So I've chosen Turk Broda, who won 5 Stanley Cups in the 1940s and 50s, compiling a 1.97 goals against average and 13 shutouts over 101 postseason games. In the 51 Cup run, he allowed only 9 goals in 8 games. He also won the Vezina Trophy twice. That was back then for the leader in goals against average by default. And he was named to the Hockey Hall of Fame and the NHL's Centennial Anniversary team. And for these remaining teams in the Atlantic Division, these were so tough for me to decide that I actually put it to a viewer poll. I'm not saying that I'm going to agree with you every time. For the Tampa Bay Lightning, we've got Victor Hedman, Nikita Kucherov, or Andrei Vasilevsky. You could throw Braden Point in there as well. But when I look at these 3 players, The one who I'm excited to see continue his career the most is Nikita Kucherov. I know Victor Hedman's a little bit older. Vasilevsky, he was amazing in those 2 Stanley Cup runs. He's won a Vezina Trophy. But Kucherov, between those 2 Cup final runs and what he's done in the playoffs overall, is pretty darn impressive. So 2 Stanley Cups, of course, 2 Art Ross trophies to lead the NHL in scoring, and a Hart Trophy and a Ted Lindsay Award, which is voted on by the players as the best player in the NHL. He was the Hart Trophy runner-up last year. Let's not forget that. Now, Vasilevsky and Hedman have the Conn Smythes, but with Nikita Kucherov in the combined 48 games in 2020 and 21, he had 15 goals and 51 assists for 66 points. He led all playoff scorers both times. All right, now we've got the Detroit Red Wings. This one, of course, is going to be very difficult as an original 6 team. I boiled it down to 4 players. You have Alex Delvecchio, you have Pavel Datsyuk, you have Nicholas Lidstrom, and then you have Steve Yzerman, who was the face of the franchise for 2 decades. Now, personally, the first guy I thought of was Nick Lidstrom. After all, he's maybe the best defenseman since Bobby Orr. He's in that conversation. But Steve Yzerman, the captain of those 3 Stanley Cups, 97, 98, and 02, the player who catalyzed a resurgence of the franchise, kind of like I said with Barkov, and led them to outright dominance year after year. It's just really hard to top that. In 1989, he won the Pearson, which later became the Ted Lindsay, despite only finishing 3rd for the Hart. Then he won the Conn Smythe in 1998. He led the playoffs with 6 goals and 18 assists in 22 games. He won the Selke Trophy in 2000. He's part of the Centennial Anniversary team. In 1996, you can't forget this one when he scored the double overtime winner in Game 7 against Wayne Gretzky's Blues.
Gretzky had it, lost it, Yzerman picks it up. Yzerman moving, blue line chance. Steve Yzerman! Detroit wins!
I welcome friendly disagreements, but I gotta side with you guys here, and probably for this next one as well. The Montreal Canadiens. I mean, how do you even boil this down to 4 players? They have so many great players who stayed with Montreal their entire career. Howie Morenz, maybe the best player of his era. Jean Beliveau won 10 Stanley Cups with this team and was the captain, I think, for all of them or most of them. Maurice Richard, the Rocket, and Ken Dryden, who had kind of an abbreviated career, but was arguably the best goaltender in that span of seasons. But at the end of the day, when you think of the Montreal Canadiens, who's the first guy you think of? It's Maurice Richard, and it's not just because he is the Rocket and because there's a book, The Hockey Sweater, that was basically inspired by him, and that, you know, the fans rioted that one time when he assaulted a ref. But Maurice Richard was an incredible player. He's the first to score 50 goals within 50 games. Only 4 others have accomplished that in the same season. 5 times he led the league in scoring. 1947, he wins the Hart Trophy. He was also a finalist 5 other times, and he was a 4-year captain. They actually won the Stanley Cup in all 4 years of his captaincy. He had a total of 8 championships. He led the playoffs in scoring 5 times, and he scored 18 game winners in 132 postseason games. That's pretty ridiculous, including the 1956 winner against the Detroit Red Wings in Game 5. That's what stood as the winner. Okay, the Metropolitan Division is up next, but first, let's kick it over to our sponsor, Pocket Hockey. I'm not just a big fan of hockey, but I'm a fan of classic arcadey sports games like NFL Blitz and NBA Jam. So if I'm gonna play a hockey game on my phone, I want something fast, frenetic, and free to play. And I gotta say, Pocket Hockey knows how to scratch that itch. It's a little backyard hockey meets NHL Hits meets Nintendo's Weverse. It's launching March 20th, but you can pre-order it right now in the App Store and the Play Store. You start with 3 skaters and a goalie, but over time upgrade their attributes and unlock more heroes. And I'm not just talking about a bunch of John Does. Take a look at some of these players' names and appearances. Easily my favorite thing about the game. I mean, check out the flow on Jeremy. It's so voluminous that it literally shields him from being knocked down. There's no steep learning curve or intricate strategy, but there are some fun gameplay dynamics nonetheless. If you continuously pump the puck on net, you'll actually briefly knock down the goaltender. Then there's the button-mashing frenzy of fighting, and if you're so fortunate, you'll briefly knock down all 3 of your opponent's skaters. Now that's an odd man rush. There are over 10 unlockable player emotes, or in other words, 10 plus ways to celly after a goal, and a handful of unlockable uniforms. And if you know me, I'm more than willing to grind my way for a teal jersey. On top of all that, there's a friendly battle mode where you can invite your buddy and face off for bragging rights. So pre-order Pocket Hockey in the App Store or the Play Store right now by tapping the link in the pinned comment or video description. Hope to see you on the ice, Twisters. Now back to our video. Alright guys, let's move on to the Metropolitan Division. For the Columbus Blue Jackets, I've chosen Zach Werenski. All the other top players for the Blue Jackets have gone on to play elsewhere. We're talking about Rick Nash, Artemi Panarin, Sergei Bobrovsky. Werenski, he's still pretty young in his career. He's got lots of great years ahead, but he's already been a franchise figurehead for the Columbus Blue Jackets. In 542 games, he has over 364 points. This year, he actually has a pretty good chance of finishing as a Norris Trophy finalist. I think that getting into the playoffs would definitely help his case. And I know it's not technically NHL games, even though this is NHL player-comprised rosters, but he was very good at the Four Nations face-off. For the Philadelphia Flyers, it's, I think, hands down Bobby Clarke, because Bernie Parent played briefly with the Leafs and the Bruins. Only Marcel Dion, Guy Lafleur, and Phil Esposito scored more points in the 1970s than Bobby Clarke. He was the captain of the Cup-winning teams in 1974 and 75. The first time around, he scored the overtime winner in Game 2 to help the Flyers tie up the series. He won 3 Hart Trophies, a Pearson Award, and a Selke Trophy. He's part of the Centennial Anniversary team in the Hockey Hall of Fame, of course. 1,144 games played, 1,210 points. For the Washington Capitals, who else is it going to be than Alex Ovechkin? Although there are some other great picks out there like Nicholas Backstrom and John Carlson, Olaf Kolzig, don't forget, played his final 8 games with the Tampa Bay Lightning, and Peter Bondra did bounce around at the end of his career. It's unquestionably Ovechkin. He might break Gretzky's goal-scoring record this season. He changed the franchise dramatically. Years and years of playoff woes, and certainly he was part of that, but he guided them to the Stanley Cup final in 2018. They won for the first time in their franchise's history. He led the playoffs with 15 goals to go with 12 assists, and he won the Conn Smythe. He won the Calder Trophy. He's won 3 Hart Trophies, the Art Ross for leading the NHL in points, 3 Pearson/Ted Lindsay Awards, 9 Rocket Richards, and 9 seasons of over 50 goals. And at that time in the NHL, goal scoring wasn't quite at the level that it is right now. For the New Jersey Devils, it's got to be Patrick Elias. He was part of 2 of their 3 Stanley Cups. He led the 2000 playoffs with 13 assists to go with 7 goals, including the late game winner versus the Flyers in Game 7 of the conference final in a very contentious series. Elias is kind of on that fringe of being a Hockey Hall of Fame player. He had 10 seasons of at least 20 goals, played in 1,240, and he had a total of 1,025 points, largely in a low-scoring era. Not so fast, though, to Martin Brodeur, because he finished his career by playing with the St. Louis Blues for 7 games, and don't forget Scott Niedermayer finished his career with the Mighty Ducks/Ducks. For the New York Rangers, there are several great players to consider here, but I've got goaltender Henrik Lundqvist. You could also consider Rod Gilbert and Mike Richter. Now, Lundqvist was the 205th draft pick in 2000. He won 459 regular season games. That is 6th all-time. He finished as a Vezina Trophy finalist in his first 3 years. That's not easy to do, but he won the award in 2012, finishing as a Hart Trophy finalist that year as well. As for the postseason, he was mostly lights out, compiling a .921 save percentage and 2.30 goals against average with 10 shutouts in 130 games. He reached the final in 2014, but the Rangers couldn't get over the hump. And for anybody who thought about Brian Leetch, don't forget, he finished his career with Toronto and Boston. Here's another one that was boiled down to a viewer poll. It's the Carolina Hurricanes. I've got Sebastian Aho or Jacob Slavin. So you guys, hey, you'll notice a trend here that you're not the biggest fan of defensemen. Sebastian Aho, certainly in that conversation, at least as a top 10 center in the NHL, but I'm more certain that Jacob Slavin is one of the 10 best defensemen in the NHL. So I've got Jacob Slavin, certainly in that conversation as the best shutdown defenseman of this decade. A lot of you out there saw what he did in the Four Nations faceoff, but even before then, in big games, Jacob Slavin is able to take on the best competition out there. Sure, he doesn't even have 300 points in over 720 games, but in the playoffs, he actually has 42 points in 82 games. And we also have to think about how good he's made other defensemen look. He was paired with Dougie Hamilton, who was in the Norris Trophy conversation. Tony DeAngelo was a regular offensive contributor with Slavin, and Brent Burns was also in that Norris Trophy conversation in his first year with Carolina. And out of curiosity, if we lump in the Hartford Whalers, there really isn't someone who stands out that much who actually stayed with the Whalers/Hurricanes. But for anybody who thought about Cam Ward, who won the Conn Smythe in 2006, don't forget, he played his final season with the Chicago Blackhawks. All right, 2 more viewer polls for this division. The New York Islanders, it's a great debate here because Brian Trottier and Billy Smith might be out of the conversation, but you have Dennis Potvin and you have Mike Bossy. Bossy, to some, is still the greatest goal scorer of all time. And unfortunately, his career was cut short due to injuries. Rest in peace to Mike Bossy, just one of the all-time great gentlemen of this game. but I was always leaning toward Dennis Potvin. He was the captain of this team during their 4 consecutive Stanley Cups in the early 1980s, and I also read 5 articles ranking the greatest Islanders, and Potvin was ranked ahead of Bossy in 4 of those. Kind of like what I said with Lidstrom, Potvin's in that conversation as the NHL's best defenseman to play after Bobby Orr. You could also put in Larry Robinson, Ray Bourque, right? He won 3 Norris trophies and 3 separate times was a finalist for that. He also finished top 10 in Hart Trophy voting in 7 straight years, including once as the runner-up. And to wrap up the Metropolitan Division, we've got the Pittsburgh Penguins. And I did put Malkin in our viewer poll, but really, it's between Crosby and Lemieux. It's got to be Mario Lemieux. It's hard to dethrone somebody who was, to some, even better than Wayne Gretzky. He was the 13-year captain of the Penguins, including during their cup runs in 91 and 92. He won both Conn Smythes. The next year, he produced 160 points in just 60 games, and that points per game is just ever so slightly less than what Wayne Gretzky did in his best season. That was 215 points in 80 games. Lemieux won 3 Hart trophies, and he was a finalist 4 other times. He also won the Calder, 6 Art Ross titles, 4 Pearson Awards, and 3 times led the NHL in goals. Of course, part of the Centennial Anniversary team and the Hockey Hall of Fame. All right, we're going to move on to the Central Division. We'll start with the Dallas Stars. I've got Jamie Benn. He's been the captain since 2013. Not bad for a guy that was drafted 129th overall. He won the Art Ross in 2015, and the next year he finished as a Hart Trophy finalist. He captained Dallas to a surprising appearance in the 2020 Stanley Cup Final, and in 1,169 games at the time of recording, he has a total of 944 points, some of that coming in a lower scoring era. Don't forget Mike Modano. He played his final season at the age of 40 with the Red Wings, and Marty Turco played the last 34 games of his career with Chicago and Boston. All right, let's get to the Utah Hockey Club. Now, they're in just their first season as Utah, so if we're going to just choose basically the best player on this team, it's Clayton Keller. And that's in addition to what he's already done with Arizona when he had 2 30-goal seasons there. He's the current captain of Utah. Now, if we were to, backpedal a little bit here and bundled in the Coyotes because of the inherited roster, and even if you wanted to, put in the original Winnipeg Jets, theoretically, it's still probably Shane Doan then. Okay, now we go to the Minnesota Wild, and I know that he's only played there for several seasons, but it's got to be Kirill Kaprizov because he is easily the biggest talent that this franchise has ever had, at least in terms of serving his full time with Minnesota. Now, Mikko Koivu, don't forget, played his final 7 games with Columbus. Kaprizov was drafted at just 135th overall in 2015. Years later, he won the Calder in 21, and he finished 7th for the Hart Trophy the next year. And at the time of recording, in 315 games, he has over 382 points. He already has 3 seasons of at least 40 goals. And I would also shout out Jared Spurgeon and Jonas Brodin for what they've done in their careers there. Let's go to the St. Louis Blues next. Bernie Fedorko actually played his final year with the Red Wings, so he's excluded from this. So the next guy I thought of among skaters was Brian Sutter, but it's kind of hard for me to not pick Jordan Binnington in this case. He helped the Blues win their first Stanley Cup ever, breaking a 52-year drought back in 2019. During that run, he had a .914 save percentage and a 2.46 goals against average, but in Game 7 of the final in Boston, he stopped 32 of 33 shots. He finished 5th for the Vezina that year and runner-up for the Calder. And I know his numbers aren't spectacular over the course of his career, .907 save percentage, 2.80 goals against average, but he's been known to perform very well in many big games out there. We saw what he did in the Four Nations face-off. Speaking of goaltenders, we've got the Winnipeg Jets next. And I think it's got to be Connor Hellebuyck. Mark Scheifele, Kyle Connor, and Josh Morrissey are good picks, but Hellebuyck is a cut above them. He already has 2 Vezina trophies. He's been a finalist 2 other times, and he's won a Jennings Trophy. This year is pretty promising for him to take home an award or 2 as well. In 309 games, he has a .917 save percentage, a 2.58 goals against average, and 43 shutouts. He's saved 62 goals above average in just the last 2 years alone. Now, there wasn't really one standout guy who played for both the Jets and the Thrashers before then, but if we bundle in the original Winnipeg Jets, the other guy that I want to shout out here would probably be Thomas Steen. For the Chicago Blackhawks, Jonathan Toews is a great honorable mention, not so fast to several other Blackhawks out there who did serve with other teams at some point in their career, like Tony Esposito, Pierre Pilote, and Bobby Hull, but it's gotta be Stan Mikita. 2 Hart trophies, 4 Art Rosses, a Hockey Hall of Fame induction, part of the centennial anniversary team. He led the 1961 playoffs with 6 goals in 12 games as the Hawks won their final Stanley Cup until 2010. He scored what stood as the game winner versus the Red Wings in Game 5. Chicago also reached the final 4 other times. This is during the original 6 era and into the expansion era. With Stan Mikita, he played all 1,396 games with Chicago, scoring 541 goals and adding 926 assists for 1,467 points. Let's go to the Colorado Avalanche next. So, Nathan MacKinnon is doing amazing things. He could win his 2nd Hart Trophy this year, but it's still Joe Sakic.
Pass, second, score! Super Joe!
Now, other great players include Cale Makar, Milan Hajduk, and Gabriel Landeskog, but Burnaby Joe is on top here. After a prolific stint with the Nordiques, who moved to Denver, in his first season with the Avs, he took his game to the next level, scoring a career-high 120 points and captaining the Avs to their first Stanley Cup. And 5 years later, he took home the Hart, the Pearson, the Lady Byng, and actually was second for the Selke, but he went off in the playoffs for 13 goals and 13 assists as the Avs defeated the defending champion Devils for another championship. They won in 7 games. What a great cup that was. Combining his time with Quebec and Colorado, in 1,378 games, Sakic had 1,641 points. All right, and the last team in this division is the Predators, and this boils down between Pekka Rinne and Roman Josi. Now, 64% of you voted Pekka. I thought about Josi a little bit as well, but really for me, I watched Pekka Rinne extensively over the course of his career. I know that they had Shea Weber during his time there at one point, and then Josi later on, but Rinne was always kind of the anchor of this team. A top 5 goalie for most of his career. And I know that sometimes he faltered in the playoffs, but sometimes he was just too good for a team that had very little star talent, especially up front. He won the 2018 Vezina, and he was actually a finalist 3 other times. He finished 4th for the Hart Trophy in 2011, and in that 2017 Cup final run, he had a 1.96 goals against average and a .930 save percentage with 2 shutouts. He actually had 3 assists, by the way. He should be a future Hall of Famer. He's arguably Finland's best goalie ever, and as I sort of alluded to earlier, Rinne was a huge reason why Nashville, as an underdog in a lot of these playoffs, was able to outperform expectations and cause a couple of crazy upsets. All right, and let's cap things off with the Pacific Division. So let's quickly go through the Kraken and the Golden Knights because they've only been in the NHL for so long. For Seattle, it would be Matty Beniers. If we're choosing somebody who has played only as a Kraken, then it's technically going to be him. He was the 2nd overall pick in 2021. He won the Calder Trophy in 2023. He also had 3 goals and 4 assists in 14 games as the Kraken actually won a series and lost in 7 in the 2nd round. But if we're talking about somebody who was part of the expansion draft or that off season, even though they came from somewhere else, I would think of somebody like Jared McCann, maybe Vince Dunn, Joey Decord. Those would be some of the players that stand out to me there. The same thing goes for the Vegas Golden Knights. Now, even though he wasn't part of the cup-winning team like Nick Hague or Keegan Colasar, I've selected Pavel Dorofeyev because he's having quite a breakout season so far, and he hasn't even approached his prime just yet. But if we're going to count players who played somewhere else and then were part of the expansion draft or the first offseason for the Golden Knights, it would probably be Shea Theodore or William Karlsson. For the Los Angeles Kings, I've got Captain Anze Kopitar. Honorable mentions, though, to Drew Doughty, Dustin Brown, and Dave Taylor. Kopitar has been the Kings captain since 2016. He's won 2 Stanley Cups with them. He led the playoffs in scoring both times, including in 2012 when he led in both goals and assists. He had the overtime winner in Game 1 against the Devils in the final. Kopitar also has 2 Selke trophies. He has 13 seasons of at least 20 goals, and he has over 1,250 points in over 1,400 games, all with Los Angeles. And for anybody who thought about Marcel Dion, don't forget that he started his career with the Red Wings and then finished with the Rangers. Similar thing with Luc Robitaille, he served time with both teams in addition to the Penguins. Now for the Edmonton Oilers, none of the players from those cup-winning seasons in the 80s or even 1990 were with the Oilers for the entirety of their careers. Guys like Gretzky, Messier, Fuhr, Kevin Lowe, Yari Curry, they all went somewhere else. So that means if we're going to choose just one Oiler, it's got to be Connor McDavid, although Leon Draisaitl is not far behind at all. McDavid has been the Oilers captain since he was 20 years old in 2016. We all remember last year's playoffs when he won the Conn Smythe, setting a record for assists in a playoff run with 34 to go with 8 goals. as the Oilers battled back from a 3-0 series deficit against the Florida Panthers and forced Game 7. He has won 3 Hart Trophies, 4 Ted Lindsay Awards, 5 Art Rosses, and he also has a Rocket Richard. He's working on his 8th 100-point season, and in about 700 games, he's already scored over 1,050 points, and he's only 28 years old.
Still short-handed, McDavid shoots, scores! Connor McDavid with his first goal of a Stanley Cup playoff.
For the Anaheim Ducks, it's got to be Ryan Getzlaf. I think that's pretty much undisputed here. He was the team's captain for 12 seasons, and he was the Hart Trophy runner-up in 2014. He was largely a beast in the playoffs. He had 125 points in just 125 games, and some of that coming, of course, in a lower-scoring era. He also won the Lone Cup in franchise history back in 2007. He just turned 22 years old when that happened. He had 3 game-winning goals in that playoff run, including in Game 4 of the conference final versus the powerhouse Red Wings, and in over 1,100 games played, he had over 1,000 points. The Calgary Flames kind of remind me of Ottawa in that their best players have served time elsewhere. Guys like Al McInnes, Jerome McGinley, Joe Nieuwendyk. So then that means that, kind of like I chose Chris Phillips with Ottawa, I went with Mikael Backlund. I couldn't really come up with a ton for Backlund here, but 3 times he has finished in top 10 Selke Trophy voting. In over 1,000 games, he has 210 goals and 343 assists for 563 points. And hey, he does have a King Clancy Award for leadership both on and off the ice. Not so fast Mika Kiprusoff, who played 47 games in his first 3 years with the Sharks. For the Vancouver Canucks, it's either Sedin twin here, but I'm going to say Henrik Sedin. Don't forget, Trevor Linden played for the Canadiens, Islanders, and Capitals a little bit. Henrik captained the Canucks for 8 years and got them to Game 7 of the 2011 final. He scored 3 goals and 19 assists as Vancouver, one of the better teams I've seen not win the Stanley Cup, came oh so very close. And the year prior, he captured the Hart and the Art Ross. It was one of 8 seasons in which he had at least 70 points. Alright guys, and we wrap things up with my favorite team, and that's the San Jose Sharks. Of course, Thornton, Marlowe, they played elsewhere, Pavelski, Burns. So this boils down to Logan Couture and Marc-Edouard Vlasic. Now I love Logan Couture. He was second in the 2010s in goals during the playoffs. But to me, prime Marc-Edouard Vlasic was something else, and he's the best defender in San Jose Sharks history. In the first 12 years of his career, he averaged about 22 minutes of time on ice, and it's not like he was a power play quarterback either. A lot of that was killing penalties and even strength. The Sharks' defense actually averaged the 8th fewest goals against in the NHL during that time. Pickles' best year overall might have been the 2015-16 season. He produced 8 goals and 31 assists in 67 games, and during the playoffs, he put up 12 points in 24 games, and he led the playoffs with a plus 14 rating. And I know that stat doesn't really tell much of the story, but when you look at the top players for the teams that he played against, whether that was Philip Forsberg or Vladimir Tarasenko not in garbage time, or Sidney Crosby, those guys weren't scoring goals when he was out there on the ice, and the Sharks nearly were able to get their first Stanley Cup in franchise history. Alright Twisters, well what do you think of my picks here? Let me know in the comments down below, and feel free to shout out other ideas you have for video topics. Also, don't forget to pre-order Pocket Hockey on the App Store or the Play Store by clicking the link in the description or the pinned comment down below. Thanks so much for watching everybody, I'm Nick, and I'll catch you Twisters later.